Waitress was fired for her kindness, and Millionaire saw her pendant, the same one he gave to his daughter before she disappeared 22 years ago. The hum of clattering plates, the aroma of sizzling burgers, and the faint notes of a pop song playing over the speakers blended into the usual symphony of the modest diner in the heart of New York City. Zoe weaved through the crowded tables, her hands expertly balancing a tray of steaming dishes. Her smile was constant, even as the weight of a long shift pressed down on her shoulders. For Zoe, being a waitress wasn't just about taking orders. It was about bringing a touch of kindness to someone's day, even if that kindness rarely came back to her. The door chimed as it swung open, letting in a gust of cool evening air. A man entered, his tailored suit and polished shoes starkly contrasting with the diner's casual vibe. He walked with purpose, though his gaze was distant, his expression hard to read. Conversations quieted briefly as a few curious eyes followed him. He paused, surveying the room before settling into a booth in the far corner. Away from the chatter, Zoe noticed him immediately. It wasn't just his appearance, sharp jawline, streaks of gray in his otherwise dark hair, that caught her attention. There was something about the way he sat, shoulders rigid yet heavy, as if he carried a weight no one could see. She grabbed a menu and approached with her usual warmth. "Good evening, sir. Welcome. Can I get you started with something to drink?" Her voice was cheerful, unshaken by his imposing presence. The man glanced up, his piercing blue eyes locking with hers for a brief moment before returning to the menu. "Water," he said curtly. His voice was deep, controlled. Zoe nodded, unfazed. "Of course, I'll be right back." She returned moments later with a glass of water and took his order. A steak, medium rare, with a side of asparagus. As the kitchen worked on his meal, Zoe continued tending to other tables, but her eyes occasionally flicked back to the man in the corner. He barely moved, staring at his phone but scrolling with no real purpose. There was an air of sadness about him, though she couldn't quite place why. When his food arrived, he ate mechanically, each bite deliberate but devoid of enjoyment. He lingered only long enough to finish his meal before standing abruptly and pulling out his wallet to pay. Zoe had just finished clearing another table when she noticed something fall to the floor near his booth. A sleek black wallet, its leather shining faintly under the diner's fluorescent lights. "Excuse me, sir," Zoe called, weaving through the tables to catch him just as he was stepping outside into the crisp evening air. The man turned, startled. She held up the wallet. "You dropped this." He hesitated for a moment, then reached out, his features softening slightly. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice quieter this time. Zoe smiled politely and turned to go back inside, but something stopped him. His eyes had caught the faint glint of gold around her neck. A delicate pendant dangled there, shaped like a heart, and adorned with a small sapphire in its center. His breath hitched. He knew that pendant. It was unmistakable. He had given it to his daughter, Emily, on her 5th birthday, just weeks before she disappeared in a tragic accident over 2 decades ago. "Wait," he said, his tone more urgent now. Zoe turned back, her brows knitting in confusion. "That necklace," he said, pointing. "Where did you get it?" Her hand instinctively went to the pendant, her fingers brushing over its smooth surface. "Oh, it was a gift from my mom. She gave it to me when I was little." "Why?" Joseph Carter, though she didn't yet know his name, struggled to compose himself. His mind raced with questions he couldn't ask here, not now. "It's unique," he managed, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "I've seen one just like it before." Zoe shrugged, a bit uncomfortable under his intense gaze. "Yeah, it's special to me anyway. Have a good night." She offered a polite wave and disappeared back into the diner, leaving Joseph standing alone on the sidewalk. He remained there for a long moment, the noise of the city fading into the background. Could it be? He shook his head. No, it was impossible. Emily had been gone for 22 years, yet the sight of that pendant stirred something in him. A fragile, dangerous hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. Inside, Zoe returned to her work, brushing off the strange interaction. Customers came and went, and the hours dragged on, by the time her shift ended. She had almost forgotten about the man in the suit. Almost. Joseph, however, couldn't forget. Back in his penthouse apartment, he poured himself a glass of scotch and stared out at the twinkling lights of the city. The pendant, her face, the way she had smiled. It was all seared into his mind. There was a familiarity to her he couldn't shake, no matter how much he tried to convince himself otherwise. The next evening, as Zoe arrived for her shift, she noticed him again, seated in the same booth. His presence was a weight she couldn't ignore. Something told her this wasn't the last time she'd see him. The diner was busier than usual that evening, the clinking of glasses and the hum of conversation filling every corner. Zoe moved swiftly between tables, her cheerful demeanor masking the exhaustion from another long day. But as she approached the corner booth, her steps slowed. The man from the night before was back, seated in the same spot. His presence seemed deliberate, as if he had chosen the booth for its vantage point over the bustling room. Joseph Carter sat with his hands clasped around a glass of water, his sharp eyes scanning the room until they landed on Zoe. He offered a subtle nod, almost imperceptible, but Zoe noticed. A strange unease bubbled in her chest. Why was he here again? Pushing the thought aside, she approached his table with her usual warmth. "Good evening," she greeted, holding her notepad. "Back again. Let me guess. The steak impressed you." Joseph's lips twitched into a faint smile, but the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. "Something like that," he replied. His voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it, as if he were choosing every word carefully. "I'll have the same." "Coming right up." Zoe jotted down the order, giving him a polite smile before heading toward the kitchen. She could feel his eyes on her as she walked away, a sensation that sent a chill down her spine. As the night wore on, Joseph watched Zoe intently. He wasn't trying to be intrusive, but his mind was consumed by questions. The pendant around her neck had stirred something long buried. Memories of his daughter, Emily. He had searched for years after the accident, hiring private investigators and following every lead, no matter how faint. But as the years turned into decades, hope dwindled, leaving behind only a hollow ache. Now, out of nowhere, this young woman had appeared with a pendant identical to the one he'd given Emily. Was it mere coincidence? Or could there be more to the story? Zoe tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, focusing instead on her tasks. By the time she brought Joseph's order to his table, the diner was beginning to quiet down, the rush of customers thinning out. She placed the plate in front of him and hesitated for a moment. "You know, you seem familiar," she said, her tone casual. "Have we met before?" Joseph's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his composure. "I don't think so," he said evenly. "Why do you ask?" Zoe shrugged, leaning lightly against the booth. "I don't know, I don't know. Seem like someone I've seen before. Maybe it's nothing." She straightened, brushing off her own curiosity. "Enjoy your meal." She walked away before he could respond, leaving him to stew in his thoughts. Was there something familiar about her? Or was his mind playing tricks on him because of the pendant? He couldn't let it go. He needed answers. Joseph lingered in the diner until the last customers began to leave. Zoe, now clearing tables, noticed him checking his watch but making no move to get up. Finally, she approached, a mix of irritation and curiosity in her expression. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "You've been here a while." He glanced up at her, his gaze steady. "I wanted to ask you something," he began, his tone serious. Zoe hesitated. "Sure, what is it?" "That necklace," he said, pointing subtly toward the pendant resting against her collarbone. "You mentioned your mom gave it to you. Did she ever tell you where it came from?" Zoe blinked, her hand instinctively moving to the pendant. "Not really. She just said it was a gift and that it meant a lot to her." "Why?" Joseph considered his next words carefully. "It's unique. I knew someone who had one exactly like it a long time ago." Zoe tilted her head, a skeptical smile forming on her lips. "Small world, huh?" He didn't respond immediately, weighing whether to push further. "Do you mind if I ask? Your mom, is she still around?" The question hit a nerve. Zoe's smile faltered. "No," she said quietly. "She passed away a few years ago." "I'm sorry to hear that," Joseph said, genuinely sympathetic. "And your dad?" "Never met him," she replied with a shrug, the familiar pang of loss tugging at her chest. "It's just been me for a while." Joseph nodded, sensing that pressing further might backfire, but his resolve only grew stronger. If there was even a chance that Zoe was connected to Emily, he had to know the truth. as Zoe continued her cleanup routine. Joseph pulled out his phone and typed a quick message to his private investigator. He needed someone to look into Zoe's background, to piece together the fragments of her story. He hated the idea of invading her privacy, but he couldn't ignore the possibility staring him in the face. By the time Joseph left the diner that night, Zoe was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Something about their conversation lingered in her mind, though she couldn't pinpoint why. As she locked up and stepped into the cool night air, she glanced down at her pendant, the small sapphire catching the light from a nearby street lamp. She thought of her mom, of the stories she used to tell, and how that pendant was always a constant reminder of their bond. Miles away, Joseph sat in his office, staring out at the city skyline. The pendant, Zoe's face, her kind but guarded demeanor. It was all he could think about tomorrow. He would return to the diner. He wasn't ready to let this go. The sun dipped low over the New York skyline, casting long shadows on the diner's checkered floor. Zoe, in her worn sneakers and apron, moved with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent years navigating tight spaces and demanding customers. The evening rush was in full swing, the air thick with the mingling scents of grilled burgers and fresh coffee. At her usual station, Zoe juggled orders, her cheerful demeanor masking the exhaustion creeping into her bones. Tonight felt no different from any other, until a frail, elderly woman entered, her silver hair tucked neatly under a faded hat. She hesitated at the entrance, scanning the bustling room with a look of uncertainty. Zoe noticed immediately, without a second thought. She approached, guiding the woman to a small table near the window. "Take your time," Zoe said with a warm smile. "Let me know if you need help deciding." The woman nodded appreciatively, her hands trembling slightly as she opened the menu. Zoe could see the hesitation in her movements, the way she glanced nervously at the prices. When Zoe returned to take her order, the woman asked softly for a cup of tea and nothing more. Zoe frowned. "Are you sure that's all? We've got some great pies today. Apple, cherry. My favorite's the pecan." The woman hesitated, her lips pressed tightly together. "I'd love a slice," she admitted after a moment, "but I don't think—" "Don't worry about it," Zoe interrupted gently. "It's on me." She winked before walking away, leaving the woman visibly relieved in the kitchen. Zoe prepared the tea and plated a generous slice of pecan pie. She placed it in front of the woman with a cheerful, "Enjoy," before hurrying off to another table. It was a small gesture, but it brought a spark of warmth to Zoe's otherwise chaotic night. As the evening progressed, Zoe barely noticed Joseph Carter entering and slipping into his usual booth. He observed the scene quietly, his sharp eyes catching every detail. Zoe's kindness, the way she moved with genuine care, and the weary yet determined smile she wore like armor. She intrigued him, not just because of the pendant, but because of who she seemed to be. A person who gave freely, even when she had little herself. Zoe finally approached Joseph's table with her notepad. "Back again," she teased lightly, though her tone held genuine curiosity. "You're starting to become a regular." "I'll take the steak," Joseph replied, his lips curving into the faintest of smiles. "It seems to be the highlight of the menu." "Steak it is," Zoe said, jotting it down. "You know, one day you should branch out, try the pie." Joseph chuckled softly, surprising himself with how easily she drew a reaction from him. "Maybe next time." Their brief exchange was interrupted by a sharp voice from the back of the diner. "Zoe!" barked a man in his late 40s. His face flushed and his arms crossed over his chest. It was Greg, the diner's manager, and he was clearly in a foul mood. Zoe sighed, handing off Joseph's order to the kitchen before walking over. "What's up, Greg?" "What's up?" he repeated, his voice rising. "What's up is that I just saw you giving away a slice of pie to that woman over there." "Do you think this is a charity?" Zoe frowned. "She couldn't afford it, Greg. It's just one slice of pie, it's not—" "I don't care," Greg snapped, his face growing redder. "This is a business. Every penny counts. You can't just give food away like it's yours to hand out." "She was hungry," Zoe countered, her tone firm but calm. "It was one slice of pie, if it's that big of a deal. Take it out of my tips." Greg's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed like he might relent. But then he pointed toward the door. "You know what? If you can't follow the rules, you're done. Take your stuff and go." Zoe blinked. Stunned. "You're firing me over a piece of pie." "Damn right I am," Greg barked. "Now get out." The diner fell silent as Zoe stood frozen, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She took a deep breath, nodded, and untied her apron. She refused to let Greg see her tears. "Fine," she said, her voice steady. "I'll go." She grabbed her bag and walked out into the cool night, the humiliation of the moment hitting her harder once she was outside. She wasn't sure what hurt more, losing her job or being humiliated in front of everyone, including Joseph. To her surprise, Joseph was waiting by the curb. He had left his booth without her noticing. "Zoe," he called softly, his tone more gentle than she'd ever heard it. She stopped, turning toward him with a wary expression. "What do you want?" Joseph hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I saw what happened in there. That was unfair." Zoe shrugged, brushing a tear from her cheek. "Life's unfair," she said simply. "But thanks." He took a step closer. "Can I buy you a coffee, just to talk?" Zoe raised an eyebrow. "Talk about what?" "The pendant," he admitted, his voice steady. "I want to know more about it. About you." Her hand instinctively went to the pendant resting against her collarbone. Part of her wanted to walk away, but something about Joseph's sincerity made her pause. Finally, she sighed. "Fine, but it's just coffee." A faint smile crossed Joseph's face. "Just coffee." They walked together to a nearby cafe, neither realizing how much that conversation would change their lives. The small cafe was quiet, its warm amber lighting casting a soft glow over the polished wooden tables. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods lingered in the air as Zoe and Joseph settled into a corner booth. Zoe wrapped her hands around a steaming mug of tea, while Joseph sipped his coffee. His gaze fixed on her pendant. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of quiet conversations and the occasional clink of cups provided a buffer for the awkward silence. Zoe finally broke it with a sigh. "All right," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Let's get this out of the way. Why are you so interested in my necklace?" Joseph placed his coffee cup down, choosing his words carefully. "It's not just a necklace to me," he began. "I gave one exactly like it to someone very special a long time ago. Seeing it again, it brought back memories." Zoe frowned, her fingers instinctively brushing the small golden heart resting against her collarbone. "My mom gave it to me when I was little," she said. "She always said it was a symbol of love, something to remind me that no matter what, I wasn't alone." Joseph's chest tightened at her words. He leaned forward slightly, his tone gentle but firm. "Did she ever tell you where she got it?" Zoe hesitated, her brows furrowing as she searched her memory. "Not really," she admitted. "She just said it had been with her for a long time. She wasn't big on details." "What about your dad?" Joseph asked cautiously. Zoe's expression hardened slightly. "Never met him. My mom raised me on her own until she passed away a few years ago. After that, it was just me." "I'm sorry," Joseph said sincerely. He could see the flicker of pain in her eyes, a familiar ache he recognized from his own reflection. "It must have been difficult." Zoe shrugged, a practiced gesture that masked years of loneliness. "You get used to it," she said simply, her tone betraying nothing. Joseph studied her carefully. There was something in her demeanor, a quiet strength, a resilience. That reminded him of Emily, but he knew he couldn't press too hard. Not yet. Instead, he gestured toward the pendant. "Would you mind if I took a closer look?" Zoe hesitated, her fingers clutching the pendant protectively. She didn't fully trust Joseph, but something about his request felt different reluctantly. She unclasped the chain and slid the necklace across the table. Joseph picked it up gently, holding it as if it might break. The small sapphire gleamed under the light, its deep blue color as vibrant as he remembered. He turned the pendant over, and there it was, the tiny inscription on the back, almost imperceptible to the naked eye. "To Emily, with all my love." Joseph's hand trembled slightly as he placed the necklace back on the table. His throat tightened, and for a moment he couldn't speak. He looked up at Zoe, who was watching him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "What's wrong?" she asked. He forced a steadying breath, masking the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "This pendant," he said carefully, "is exactly like the one I gave my daughter, Her name was Emily. Zoe blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected revelation. Was? She asked softly. Joseph nodded, his jaw tightening. She disappeared when she was 5. There was an accident, a car crash. My wife and I survived. But Emily, she was gone. They never found her. Zoe's heart ached at the raw pain in his voice, but she remained guarded. I'm sorry, she said sincerely, though confusion flickered in her mind. But what does that have to do with me? Joseph met her gaze, his blue eyes searching hers as if trying to piece together a puzzle. I don't know, he admitted, but that pendant, there's no mistaking it. I had it made specifically for her. Seeing it again after all these years, he trailed off, shaking his head. It's not a coincidence. Zoe frowned, her skepticism returning. Are you saying you think I'm your daughter? That I'm Emily? I'm saying it's possible, Joseph said evenly. And if there's even a chance, I have to know the truth. Zoe leaned back in her chair, her mind reeling. It was absurd, impossible. Her mom had always told her she was adopted, but she'd never thought much of it. Now, this stranger was claiming she might be someone else entirely. Look, I don't know what to tell you, she said after a long pause. My mom never said anything about this. She's the only family I've ever known. I understand, Joseph said. But would you consider taking a DNA test, just to be sure? Zoe stared at him, the weight of his request settling heavily on her shoulders. The idea of opening that door, of uncovering something she might not be ready to face, terrified her, but there was something in Joseph's eyes, a sincerity that made her pause. I don't know, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. This is a lot to take in. I'm not asking for an answer now, Joseph said quickly. Just think about it, please. Zoe nodded slowly, reaching for her pendant and slipping it back around her neck. I'll think about it, she said, though her mind was already racing with questions she couldn't yet bring herself to ask. Joseph watched as she stood, her tea untouched. Thank you, he said quietly. She didn't respond, her thoughts too clouded to form words. As she stepped out into the cold night, Joseph remained behind, staring at the empty seat across from him. For the first time in years, hope flickered in his chest, fragile but persistent. The morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Zoe's modest apartment, casting soft patterns on the worn hardwood floor. She sat at the small kitchen table, a mug of coffee cradled in her hands, staring absently at the pendant resting against her chest. Sleep had eluded her the night before, her thoughts consumed by Joseph's words. The idea that she could be his long-lost daughter was ludicrous, wasn't it? She had spent her entire life believing her mother had found her, loved her, and raised her as her own. And yet, the pendant around her neck now felt heavier, as if carrying secrets she hadn't been ready to face. Lauren, her best friend and roommate, shuffled into the kitchen in pajama bottoms and an oversized t-shirt, her hair a messy halo. She poured herself coffee before plopping into the chair across from Zoe. You've got that look, Lauren said, sipping from her mug. What look? The one that says you've been overthinking something all night. Lauren leaned forward, resting her chin in her palm. Spill. Zoe hesitated, then took a deep breath. You remember that guy I told you about? The one who's been coming to the diner? The fancy suit guy? Lauren raised an eyebrow. What about him? Zoe recounted the conversation from the cafe, her voice wavering as she described Joseph's revelation about the pendant. By the time she finished, Lauren's eyes were wide. Wait. Lauren set her mug down, holding up a hand. He thinks you're his missing daughter, like some long-lost, tragic rich family story. Are you serious? Zoe nodded, chewing on her bottom lip. It sounds crazy, right? Well, yeah, Lauren said bluntly. But, I mean, the necklace thing is weird, and you were adopted, so it's not like it's impossible. That's what scares me, Zoe admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. What if it's true? What if everything I thought I knew about my life is wrong? Lauren reached across the table, squeezing Zoe's hand. Hey, it doesn't change who you are, she said firmly. You're still you, and honestly, if there's a chance this guy has answers about your past, maybe you should find out. Zoe sighed, leaning back in her chair. He wants me to take a DNA test. Are you going to do it? I don't know, Zoe admitted. It feels like opening Pandora's box. What if I find out something I don't want to know? Lauren tilted her head, considering her friend's words. What if you find out something you need to know? The question lingered as Zoe prepared for her day, the pendant brushing against her chest, like a constant reminder of the choice she faced. By the time she stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, she still hadn't decided. That evening, Joseph sat in his penthouse office, a glass of scotch untouched on the desk in front of him. His private investigator, Sam, stood across from him, a folder in hand. "This is everything we could find on her," Sam said, sliding the folder across the desk. "Zoe, no last name listed in the foster care records, but she was found near Albany when she was about 5 years old. No identifying documents, no record of parents. She was taken in by a single woman, Eleanor Morgan, who officially adopted her 2 years later." Joseph opened the folder, his eyes scanning the sparse records. There was a grainy black and white photo of a young Zoe, her wide eyes staring solemnly at the camera. "Albany," he muttered. "That's not far from where the accident happened." "That's not all," Sam said. "I checked the dates. She was found less than a week after the accident. And there's one more thing." He hesitated, as if unsure whether to continue. "What?" Joseph demanded, his voice sharper than intended. Sam sighed. "The pendant. The foster system documented it when she was found. It's the same one." Joseph leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. The evidence was mounting, and yet doubt lingered. "Thank you, Sam. That'll be all for now." After Sam left, Joseph stared at the folder, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. If Zoe truly was Emily, how had she ended up so far from home? Who had taken her, and why? The next day, Zoe was back at the cafe where she and Joseph had spoken. She'd texted him earlier, agreeing to meet. When he arrived, she noticed the weariness in his eyes, a heaviness that mirrored her own. "I've been thinking," she began, stirring her tea nervously, "about the test. I'll do it." Joseph exhaled, relief washing over his face. "Thank you," he said softly. "You don't know how much this means to me." "It's not for you," Zoe said quickly. "It's for me. If there's even a chance you're right." "I need to know," Joseph nodded, understanding. "I'll make the arrangements." As they sat in silence, Zoe glanced at him. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What was she like? Your daughter?" Joseph's expression softened. "She was curious, brave. She loved to draw, and she had this laugh that could light up a room." He paused, his voice growing thick. "I failed her. I wasn't there when she needed me." Zoe's chest tightened at the raw pain in his voice. She wanted to say something, to reassure him, but the words wouldn't come. The conversation shifted to logistics, how and where the test would be done. But as they parted ways, Zoe couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something bigger than she'd ever imagined. Zoe sat in the sterile clinic waiting room, her knee bouncing anxiously as she glanced at the clock on the wall. The soft hum of fluorescent lights did nothing to calm her nerves across from her. Joseph sat composed, his hands resting on his lap. Yet, his piercing blue eyes betrayed the whirlwind of emotions beneath his calm exterior. She had agreed to this, told herself it was the right thing to do. But now that she was here, doubt crept in. What if this man really was her father? What if he wasn't? Either outcome felt equally terrifying. "Zoe," the nurse called, breaking the tense silence. Joseph stood as Zoe hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the chair. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready," he said softly. "I'm ready," she replied. Though her voice wavered, she followed the nurse into a small room where a simple cheek swab was taken. The process was over in minutes, yet it felt monumental. When she returned to the waiting room, Joseph had already completed his part. He stood as she approached, offering her a small, encouraging smile. "It's done," he said. "Now we wait." The walk back to Zoe's apartment was quiet. She had insisted on walking. Needing the fresh air to clear her mind, Joseph, to her surprise, had offered to join her, and she hadn't had the heart to refuse. The city bustled around them, but Zoe felt like she was moving through a fog. Her thoughts kept circling back to the pendant, the clinic, the possibility that her entire life was about to change. She glanced at Joseph out of the corner of her eye. He walked beside her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his overcoat, his expression unreadable. "Why are you so sure it's me?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Joseph stopped mid-step, turning to face her. "The pendant was the first clue," he said. "But it's more than that. It's something I can't explain. When I look at you, I see pieces of her. Your kindness, your resilience. It reminds me of Emily." Zoe felt her chest tighten at his words. "You realize how crazy this sounds, right?" she said, trying to lighten the mood. Joseph chuckled softly, a rare sound that caught her off guard. "I do. Believe me, I've spent the last few days questioning my sanity, but crazy or not, I had to try." They resumed walking, the conversation drifting to safer topics. New York's unpredictable weather, Zoe's favorite spots in the city, and Joseph's memories of a quieter life before his career consumed him. Despite the strange circumstances, Zoe found herself enjoying his company. He wasn't the cold, distant businessman she'd first assumed. Beneath his polished exterior was a man who had suffered deeply, and she couldn't help but feel a flicker of empathy. By the time they reached Zoe's apartment building, the sun was beginning to set, painting the city in hues of orange and pink. Zoe stopped at the entrance, turning to Joseph with a hesitant smile. "Thanks for walking with me." "Of course," he said, his tone genuine. "If you ever need anything—" "I know," she interrupted. "You've said that like 10 times. He smiled, a faint warmth in his expression. "Get some rest. I'll let you know as soon as the results come in." Zoe nodded and headed inside, her heart heavier than before. Upstairs, Lauren was sprawled on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up as Zoe entered. "How'd it go?" "It's done," Zoe replied. Zoe, kicking off her shoes and collapsing onto the armchair. "Now I just have to wait and overthink everything." Lauren set her phone aside, sitting up. "How are you feeling?" "Confused," Zoe admitted. "Joseph's not what I expected. He's been through so much, and part of me wants to believe him, but the other part is terrified of what this could mean. Whatever happens, you'll figure it out," Lauren said, her voice firm. "You always do." Zoe smiled weakly. "I hope you're right." The days that followed were a mix of anticipation and dread. Joseph reached out once, a short text to let her know the results would be ready soon. Zoe replied with a simple, "Thanks," unable to muster more. To distract herself, she threw herself into her new job at a small bakery down the street. The work was different from the diner, slower, quieter, but it gave her time to think. Too much time. One evening, as she was closing up, Joseph walked in. His presence was unexpected, but Zoe wasn't entirely surprised. "You're not here for cupcakes, are you?" she asked, glancing at the clock. "Not this time," he said with a small smile. "I wanted to check on you." "I'm fine," she replied, though her tone lacked conviction. Joseph studied her for a moment before nodding. "Can I walk you home?" Zoe hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, why not?" As they walked, the conversation turned to Emily. Joseph shared stories about her favorite books, her love for animals, and the time she convinced him to adopt a stray kitten. Despite his protests, Zoe found herself laughing at his anecdotes, the tension between them easing by the time they reached her building. The bond between them felt different, cautious, but real. For the first time, Zoe began to wonder if finding out the truth might not be so terrifying after all. The call came early in the morning, waking Zoe from a restless sleep. She fumbled for her phone on the nightstand, blinking against the bright screen. The number was unfamiliar, but something told her to answer. "Hello," she croaked, her voice groggy. "Zoe, it's Joseph." His voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of tension. "The results are in." She sat up quickly, her heart pounding. "Already?" "Yes. I asked the lab to expedite them," he admitted. "I didn't want to wait any longer than necessary." Zoe hesitated, the weight of his words sinking in. She had spent the past week oscillating between curiosity and dread, and now the moment of truth was here. "What do they say?" she asked quietly. Joseph's pause on the other end was long enough to make her stomach churn. "I think it would be better if we talked in person," he said finally. "Can I pick you up?" Zoe exhaled sharply, glancing at the clock. It was barely 7 a.m., and her thoughts felt too scattered to process what might come next. "Give me 30 minutes," Joseph arrived in his sleek black sedan, the car gleaming under the early morning sun. Zoe climbed in hesitantly, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her bag. He greeted her with a small, reassuring smile, though she could see the tension in his shoulders. They didn't speak much during the drive, the city streets slowly coming to life around them. Zoe's mind raced with possibilities, but she forced herself not to overthink. Whatever the answer was, she would deal with it. She had to. The car pulled up in front of a quiet cafe, far from the bustling neighborhood Zoe was used to. Joseph gestured for her to follow him inside. The place was empty except for a barista arranging pastries behind the counter. They chose a secluded booth near the back. Joseph placed an envelope on the table, the lab's logo stamped in bold letters. Zoe stared at it as if it might explode. "You haven't opened it yet?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," Joseph said, his hands folded on the table. "I wanted to do this with you." Zoe swallowed hard, her fingers trembling as she reached for the envelope. She tore it open slowly, her heart pounding in her ears. The sheet of paper inside felt heavier than it should. She unfolded it and scanned the words, her breath catching. Positive match. 99.9%. Her vision blurred as she read the words again. And then again, as if her mind couldn't fully grasp their meaning. She felt Joseph's eyes on her, his anticipation palpable. "It's true," she whispered, her voice cracking. I'm your daughter." Joseph exhaled sharply, his hand moving to cover his mouth as he leaned back in his seat for a moment. Neither of them spoke, the weight of the revelation settling over them like a heavy blanket. "Emily," Joseph said softly, the name trembling on his lips. "I can't believe it after all these years." His voice broke and he quickly composed himself, though his eyes glistened. Zoe looked at him, her emotions a tangled mess. Relief, confusion, fear, it all swirled within her, leaving her unsure of how to respond. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't have to say anything," Joseph said gently. This is overwhelming, I know. Take all the time you need." Zoe nodded, staring at the paper in her hands. It was strange how a few words on a page could upend everything she thought she knew about herself. "I don't even remember being Emily," she said, her voice quiet. "My mom, Eleanor, she's the only parent I've ever known." Joseph nodded slowly. "I understand. She raised you, loved you. I'll always be grateful to her for that." The mention of Eleanor brought a fresh wave of emotion. Zoe felt tears prick her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. "She never told me anything about where I came from," she said. "Maybe she didn't know." "Maybe," Joseph agreed, though his tone was uncertain. "Or maybe there's more to this story than we realize." They left the cafe shortly after, the air between them heavy with unspoken thoughts. Joseph drove Zoe back to her apartment, but before she got out, he turned to her. "I know this is a lot to process, but I want you to know that you're not alone. I'm here for you, always." Zoe nodded, her hand lingering on the door handle. "Thanks," she said softly. "I think I just need some time." "Take all the time you need," Joseph said, his voice steady. "And if you have questions about anything, I'll answer them." Zoe gave him a faint smile before stepping out of the car. She watched him drive away, her thoughts spinning. The truth was out, but it left her with more questions than answers. How had she ended up so far from home? Why had no one found her sooner? And most hauntingly, what had really happened the night of the accident? Upstairs, Lauren was waiting, her eyes wide with anticipation. "Well?" she demanded, practically bouncing on the couch. Zoe handed her the paper silently. Lauren's jaw dropped as she read it. "Holy, Zoe, this is insane. Tell me about it," Zoe muttered, sinking into the armchair. "I don't even know how to feel. I mean, it's real. He's my dad. But I don't remember him, Lauren. I don't remember any of it." Lauren set the paper down, her expression softening. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," she said. "This is huge. Take it one step at a time." Zoe nodded, but her mind refused to quiet. Somewhere, deep in her heart, she knew this was only the beginning. The answers she sought wouldn't come easily, and something told her the past she was about to uncover would change everything. The following days felt surreal to Zoe. The DNA test had confirmed what seemed impossible. Joseph was her father. Every time she looked at the pendant around her neck, it felt heavier, its meaning deeper. It wasn't just a sentimental gift anymore. It was a link to a life she didn't remember, to a family she had been torn away from without understanding why. Joseph texted her once a day, short messages that never pressured her, but always made it clear he was thinking of her. "Good morning, Zoe. Hope you're doing well. Let me know if you'd like to meet up. Just wanted to say I'm here whenever you're ready." She appreciated the gentleness of his approach, even if she wasn't sure how to respond. On the fourth day, after staring at his latest message for what felt like an hour, she finally typed back, "Let's meet. I have questions." They agreed to meet at a quiet park near Zoe's apartment. The autumn leaves crunched under her boots as she walked along the winding paths, her hands stuffed into her jacket pockets. Joseph was waiting on a bench near the pond, his posture straight, but his expression soft as he watched her approach. "Thanks for meeting me," Zoe said, sitting down beside him. "Thank you for agreeing to," Joseph replied, his tone warm but cautious for a moment. They sat in silence, watching a pair of ducks glide across the water. Zoe finally broke the quiet. "I don't know where to start," she admitted, her voice low. "Wherever you want," Joseph said. "I'll do my best to answer." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "What happened the night of the accident?" Joseph exhaled, his gaze dropping to the ground. "It was a rainy night," he began, his voice tinged with pain. "We were driving home from a family outing, Emily." He stopped, correcting himself. "You were in the back seat, asleep. The roads were slick and the car skidded on a sharp turn. We hit a tree." He paused, his hands tightening into fists. "When I came to, your mother and I were trapped in the car. You were gone. The back door was open. And I thought," his voice broke for a moment before he continued, "I thought you'd been thrown from the car. The police searched for weeks, but they never found you." Zoe's chest tightened as she listened. She couldn't imagine the agony of losing a child, the guilt of surviving when you thought your daughter hadn't. "But I wasn't there," she said softly. "Someone must have taken me." Joseph nodded. "That's what I've come to believe. Whoever found you that night didn't come forward. Maybe they thought they were helping. Maybe they had other reasons. I don't know." Zoe processed his words, the weight of his story settling over her. "My mom, Eleanor, she never said anything about where she found me. She just told me I was special, that I was meant to be her daughter. She was. Everything to me." Her voice faltered. "I feel like I'm betraying her by being here." Joseph reached out, hesitating before placing a hand over hers. "You're not betraying her," he said firmly. "She loved you. She gave you a life when you needed one. But you also deserve to know the truth about where you came from." Zoe looked down at his hand, so steady and warm, and nodded. "I think I want to know more," she said, her voice steadier now. "Not just about the accident, but about you and her, my mom." Joseph's face softened with relief, and for the first time, his smile reached his eyes. "I'd like that," he said. "Ask me anything." Over the next hour, Joseph shared stories of Emily's childhood, her love for drawing, her fascination with animals, the way she used to climb into his lap with a stack of books, insisting he read to her. Zoe listened intently, laughing at some stories and feeling a strange ache at others, like she was hearing about someone else entirely but still felt connected. When Joseph spoke of her mother, Deborah, his tone grew reverent. She was strong, kind, always putting everyone else first. She loved you more than anything. Losing you broke her. He looked away, his voice dropping. "It broke us." Zoe felt a pang of guilt. "I wish I could remember her," she said quietly. "I don't even know what she looked like." Joseph reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He handed it to her with a hesitant smile. This was taken a few weeks before the accident. Zoe stared at the photo, her heart clenching. A woman with warm brown eyes and a gentle smile looked back at her, holding a little girl, her younger self, in her arms. They both looked so happy, so full of life. "She's beautiful," Zoe whispered. "She was," Joseph said. "And so were you." Zoe's throat tightened, but she managed a small smile. "I look like her." "You do," Joseph said, his voice soft. in more ways than one. As they walked back to her apartment, Zoe felt something shift between them. The guarded tension she'd felt around him before was easing, replaced by something more fragile but undeniably real. She still had questions. So many questions. But for the first time, she felt like she wasn't facing them alone. Before they parted ways, Joseph turned to her. "I want you to know, Zoe, that no matter what happens next, I'm here for you, always." She nodded, her smile faint but genuine. "I know." As she watched him walk away, Zoe felt a strange mix of emotions. Grief for the life she didn't remember, gratitude for the life she'd been given, and a growing hope for the life she might still build. For the first time, she felt like she was starting to piece together who she really was. Joseph stared at the report spread out on his desk, the words blurring together as the weight of their implications sank in. His private investigator, Sam, had delivered the file just hours ago, and the details inside confirmed his worst suspicions. The accident that had changed his life, the one that had stolen Emily, was not as simple as he had believed. Someone had interfered. He picked up his phone, his hand trembling slightly as he dialed Zoe's number. The line rang twice before her voice came through, soft but steady. "Hey, Joseph." "Zoe," he began, trying to keep his tone calm. "Do you have some time today? There's something I need to talk to you about." "Sure," she replied, the hint of hesitation in her voice. "Is everything okay?" "It's complicated," he admitted. "Can we meet at my place? I think it'll be easier to explain in person." "All right, I'll be there in an hour." As he ended the call, Joseph leaned back in his chair, exhaling heavily. He had spent years carrying the guilt of losing his daughter, years believing it was all an unfortunate accident, but now he knew better. Someone had orchestrated the chaos that had ripped his family apart, and that someone had been closer than he ever imagined. When Zoe arrived at Joseph's penthouse, she was struck by its understated elegance. The sleek furniture and large windows showcasing the New York skyline seemed to belong to another world, a world she was now somehow connected to. Joseph greeted her at the door, his expression tense but welcoming. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. Zoe followed him into the living room, where a thick folder sat on the coffee table. She sat down cautiously, her eyes flicking between Joseph and the file. "What's going on?" she asked. Joseph sat across from her, his posture stiff. "I've been digging into what happened the night of the accident," he began. "I hired an investigator to look into the details. And what he found. It changes everything." Zoe's heart raced as he pushed the folder toward her. With hesitant hands, she opened it, her eyes scanning the first page. It was a police report from the night of the crash, but scribbled in the margins were notes, details that hadn't been included in the original documentation. According to the investigator, Joseph explained, there were discrepancies in the initial police report. Witnesses reported seeing another car near the crash site, but that detail was never followed up on. Zoe's brows furrowed. Another car? What does that mean? "It means someone might have been there deliberately," Joseph said, his tone heavy. "Sam found evidence that suggests the accident wasn't just an accident. Someone tampered with the scene, likely to take you." Zoe's breath hitched, her hands tightening around the folder. "But who would do that? And why?" Joseph's jaw clenched as he leaned forward. "That's the part that's hard to accept," he said quietly. "The evidence points to someone close to us. Someone I trusted." He paused, his voice hardening. "Nick Sullivan." "Nick?" Zoe asked, confusion flashing across her face. "Who's that?" "He was my best friend," Joseph said bitterly. "We built our business together. He was like a brother to me. After the accident, he was the one who helped me keep going, who encouraged me to move forward. But now, it seems he may have had ulterior motives." Zoe stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "You think he took me? Why would he do that?" Joseph shook his head, his expression a mix of anger and sorrow. "I don't know yet, but I plan to find out." The revelation left Zoe reeling. She spent the next few days in a fog, trying to reconcile the life she'd known with the dark truths that were beginning to surface. The idea that someone had intentionally taken her, ripping her away from her family, was almost too much to bear. Joseph, meanwhile, was relentless. He spent hours combing through old records, hiring additional investigators, and piecing together the fragments of a puzzle that had haunted him for decades. His focus was singular, uncovering the truth about Nick's involvement. It wasn't long before a breakthrough came. One of the investigators unearthed financial records linking Nick to a series of suspicious payments made to an untraceable account around the time of the accident. The timing was damning, and the amounts were too large to ignore. Joseph confronted Nick at his office, storming past the secretary with a fury that turned heads. Nick, seated behind a sleek desk, looked up in surprise. "Joseph," he said, standing. "What's going on?" "You tell me," Joseph snapped, slamming a copy of the financial records onto the desk. "What are these payments, Nick, and why do they coincide with the night of the crash?" Nick's expression darkened, his mask of composure slipping for a brief moment before he forced a smile. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said smoothly. "Those records could mean anything." "Don't lie to me," Joseph growled, his voice low but dangerous. "I trusted you. You were there for me after the accident. But now I find out you might have been involved. Did you take her, Nick? Did you take my daughter?" Nick's silence was answer enough. His jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists as he struggled for words. "You don't understand," he said finally. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that." Joseph's blood ran cold. "What did you do?" Nick didn't answer. Instead, he turned away, his shoulders slumping. "You wouldn't understand," he muttered. "You had everything. The perfect family, the perfect life. I just wanted something for myself." Joseph's fury boiled over, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Where is she?" he demanded. "Where's Deborah?" Nick's head snapped up, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," he said quickly. "I swear, Joseph, I don't know." Joseph didn't believe him. Turning on his heel, he stormed out, already planning his next move. He would find Deborah, and when he did, he would make sure Nick paid for everything. Joseph paced his office, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. The confrontation with Nick had confirmed his worst fears, but it also left him with more questions than answers. The man he had once considered a brother had betrayed him, and now the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. The phone on his desk buzzed, breaking his thoughts. He snatched it up. "Sam, what do you have for me?" Sam's voice came through steady but urgent. "I followed up on the lead you gave me about Nick's financial records. It took some digging, but I found a connection to a remote property in Vermont. It's owned by a shell corporation, but all signs point back to Nick." Joseph's grip tightened on the phone. "And Deborah, there's reason to believe she's there," Sam replied cautiously. "Neighbors reported seeing activity at the property over the years. Deliveries, maintenance workers, but no one's ever seen who lives there." Joseph's heart pounded. After all these years, could it really be true? Could Deborah still be alive? He had to find out. "Send me the address," he ordered. "I'm going there myself." "Joseph," Sam warned, "if Nick's involved, you need to be careful. He's already proven he's willing to cross lines." "I'll be careful," Joseph said firmly, "but I'm not waiting another day." Later that evening, Zoe sat cross-legged on the couch, scrolling aimlessly through her phone. The past few days had been an emotional whirlwind, and she was still trying to process the revelations about Nick. The idea that someone had deliberately taken her, ripped her from her family, was overwhelming. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She frowned, glancing at the clock. It was late. Who could it be? She opened the door cautiously and was surprised to see Joseph standing there, his expression taut with urgency. "Joseph?" she asked, stepping aside to let him in. "What's going on?" "I found something," he said, his voice low but intense. "I think I know where your mother is." Zoe froze, the words hitting her like a freight train. "What? You mean she's alive?" "There's a strong possibility," Joseph said, his gaze steady. "I need to go to Vermont to find out. I came here because I thought you'd want to know." Zoe's mind raced. The woman in the photo, the one she'd stared at for hours, trying to find some connection, could still be alive. "I'm coming with you," she said without hesitation. Joseph looked surprised. "Zoe, this could be dangerous." "I don't care," she said firmly. "If there's a chance she's alive, I need to see her." Joseph hesitated, but finally nodded. "All right, we'll leave at first light." The drive to Vermont was long and tense, the air in the car thick with unspoken fears. Joseph kept his eyes on the road. His jaw tight with determination, Zoe sat in silence, her hands gripping the pendant around her neck. She didn't know what to expect, but the thought of meeting her mother, a woman she couldn't even remember, made her stomach churn. As they neared the property, the scenery grew more isolated. Tall trees lined the narrow road, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. The GPS announced their arrival, and Joseph slowed the car, pulling onto a gravel driveway that led to a small, weathered cabin. The place was eerily quiet. Overgrown grass surrounded the cabin, and the windows were covered with heavy curtains. Joseph killed the engine and turned to Zoe. "Stay behind me," he instructed. "If anything feels off, we leave. Understood?" Zoe nodded, her heart hammering in her chest. They approached the cabin cautiously, Joseph's hand hovering near his phone, ready to call for help if needed. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the stillness. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the sound of shuffling footsteps reached their ears. The door creaked open, revealing a woman with gray-streaked hair and hollow eyes. She looked frail, her skin pale as if she hadn't seen the sun in years. But when her eyes met Joseph's, something shifted. Recognition flickered, followed by a gasp. "Deborah," Joseph breathed, his voice breaking. The woman stared at him, her lips trembling. "Joseph," she whispered, her voice hoarse and weak. Tears welled in her eyes as she stepped forward, her hand reaching out to touch his face. "Is it really you?" "It's me," Joseph said, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "I thought I'd lost you forever." Zoe stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. She felt like an outsider, unsure of how to step into this reunion. But then Deborah's eyes shifted to her, widening in disbelief. "Emily," she said, her voice cracking. "Is that you?" Zoe hesitated, her throat tightening. "It's me," she said softly, the words feeling foreign, but right. Deborah sobbed, covering her mouth with her hands. "I never stopped hoping," she said, her voice trembling. "I prayed every day that you were alive." Zoe stepped forward, her own tears falling freely. "I don't remember you," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "But I want to." Deborah pulled her into a hug, her frail arms trembling as they wrapped around her daughter. "We'll make new memories," she whispered. "I'll never let you go again." Back in the car, the weight of what had just happened began to settle. Deborah, though weak and visibly shaken, had managed to explain bits and pieces of her captivity. Nick had kept her hidden, feeding her lies about Joseph and Emily to maintain control. She didn't know why he had done it, only that he seemed driven by hatred and jealousy. Zoe listened intently, her heart breaking for the mother she was just beginning to know. Joseph, meanwhile, silently vowed to make Nick pay for everything he had done. As they drove away from the cabin, Zoe glanced at Deborah, who had fallen asleep in the back seat. She reached over, placing a hand on Joseph's arm. "Thank you," she said softly. Joseph glanced at her, his expression a mix of relief and determination. "This is just the beginning," he said. "We've found her, but now we need to make sure Nick faces justice." Zoe nodded, a newfound strength rising within her. Together, they would face whatever came next. The city lights of New York flickered faintly in the distance as Joseph stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse. His phone pressed tightly to his ear. The events in Vermont replayed in his mind. Deborah's fragile frame and haunted eyes etched into his memory. She was safe now, asleep in the guest room upstairs, but the storm brewing within Joseph wouldn't let him rest. "Sam, I need you to act fast," Joseph said. "Joseph," his voice low but urgent. "We have enough evidence to confront Nick, but we need to be smart about this. He's dangerous, and I'm not taking any chances." On the other end, Sam's voice was steady. "I've already started digging deeper into his connections. If he's involved in something bigger, we'll find it." "Good," Joseph replied, his jaw tightening. "And Sam, be discreet. If Nick catches wind of this, he won't hesitate to cover his tracks." As he ended the call, Joseph turned to see Zoe standing in the doorway. She wore a hesitant expression, her arms crossed as if bracing herself. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. Zoe shook her head, stepping into the room. "I keep thinking about what Mom, Deborah, said about how Nick kept her locked away all these years. Why would he do that? Joseph sighed, gesturing for her to sit. Nick always resented me, he explained. We built this company together, but as it grew, so did his jealousy. I didn't see it at the time. I thought we were friends, brothers even, but after the accident, he paused, his voice tightening. He saw it as an opportunity. With you gone and Deborah missing, I was vulnerable, distracted. He consolidated power while I was grieving. Zoe leaned forward, her brow furrowed. But why take me? Why go that far? I don't know, Joseph admitted, frustration lacing his words. But I promise you, we'll get answers, and he'll pay for what he's done. The next morning, Deborah joined them for breakfast, her presence a mix of relief and melancholy. Though her body was frail, her voice carried the strength of someone who had endured more than anyone should. Zoe sat beside her, holding her hand as Deborah recounted fragments of her captivity. He told me you were dead, Deborah said, her voice trembling. Both of you. He said there was no point in trying to escape because I had nothing to go back to. Zoe's grip tightened on her mother's hand. How did he even keep you hidden for so long? Deborah shook her head, her eyes distant. He had people working for him. Guards, staff. They weren't loyal to him personally, just to the money he paid them. I think some of them felt sorry for me, but they were too scared to act. Joseph's hands clenched into fists. And now that we know where you were, those people will be questioned. If we can tie them to Nick, it'll strengthen our case. Zoe glanced between her parents, her heart heavy with anger and grief. What do we do next? We confront him, Joseph said firmly, but we do it on our terms. Later that day, Joseph met with Sam to finalize their plan. The evidence against Nick was overwhelming. Financial records, witness testimonies, and Deborah's own account. But Joseph knew Nick wouldn't go down without a fight. We'll need to record everything, Sam advised. If he confesses or slips up, we'll have it on tape. Joseph nodded, his jaw set. I'll make sure he talks. That evening, Joseph invited Nick to a meeting under the pretense of discussing business. The venue was carefully chosen. A private conference room in a neutral location, outfitted with hidden recording devices. Zoe insisted on coming, determined to see the man who had torn her family apart. You don't have to do this, Joseph told her as they prepared to leave. Yes, I do, Zoe said firmly. Zoe, I need to face him. Deborah stayed behind, her strength not yet recovered enough for the confrontation. As Joseph and Zoe arrived at the meeting, the tension in the air was palpable. Nick was already there, his sharp suit and easy smile masking the venom Joseph now recognized too well. Joseph, Nick greeted, rising to shake his hand. And this must be Zoe. His tone was pleasant, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Zoe held her ground, her gaze steady. You've heard a lot about me, haven't you? Nick's smile faltered for a moment before he regained his composure. Of course, Joseph has been through so much. It's good to see his family coming back together. Joseph's lips curled into a tight smile. Let's cut the small talk, Nick. We need to discuss something important. Nick's smile faded entirely, his eyes narrowing. What's this about? It's about the accident, Joseph said, his voice low but steady. And about Deborah and Emily. Nick stiffened. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play dumb, Zoe interjected, her voice sharp. We know you were there. We know what you did. Nick's eyes darted between them, a flicker of panic crossing his face. I don't know where you're getting this nonsense. Enough, Joseph interrupted, slamming a folder onto the table. We have the evidence, Nick, the payments, the property in Vermont, everything. You kept my wife captive. You took my daughter. Why? Nick's facade cracked, his jaw tightened, and his eyes burned with anger. You always had everything, he hissed. The business, the family, the perfect life. Do you know what it's like to be in someone's shadow, Joseph? To watch them succeed while you're left with scraps? You ruined our lives because of jealousy, Joseph demanded, his voice rising. You stole my family. Nick's lips twisted into a bitter smile. I didn't steal them. I just took what I deserved. The room fell silent, the weight of Nick's confession hanging heavy in the air. Joseph's hands trembled with rage, but he forced himself to stay calm. It's over, Nick. The authorities have everything they need. You won't get away with this." Nick's smug expression faltered as realization dawned. "You set me up," he spat. Joseph stood, his voice cold. "No, Nick. You set yourself up." As Nick's protests grew louder, officers entered the room, placing him in handcuffs. Zoe watched silently, her heart pounding. Justice was finally within reach, but the scars Nick had left would take much longer to heal. The sound of Nick's protests echoed in the hallway as the officers led him out of the conference room. Zoe watched in silence, her chest tight with a mix of emotions, relief, anger, and an unshakable sadness swirled within her as she tried to process the moment. Nick's confession had been everything they needed, but it didn't erase the years of pain and loss he had caused. Joseph stood beside her, his expression unreadable as he watched his former friend disappear from view, his fists clenched at his sides, and his jaw tightened with restraint. It would have been easy to lash out, to let the anger consume him, but Joseph knew this victory wasn't about vengeance. It was about closure. Zoe broke the silence, her voice steady but low. "Do you think he'll actually pay for what he's done?" Joseph turned to her, his gaze softening. "He will," he said firmly. "With the evidence we have and his confession on record, there's no way he can escape this." Zoe nodded, though the weight of it all still pressed heavily on her. "It just feels empty," she admitted. "Like even with him gone, it doesn't undo everything." Joseph placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip gentle but reassuring. "I know," he said, "but this is a start. Justice won't erase the past, but it can give us a chance to move forward." The ride back to Joseph's penthouse was quiet, the hum of the car engine filling the silence. Deborah was waiting for them when they arrived, her frail figure seated on the plush living room couch. She looked up as they entered, her eyes immediately searching for Zoe's. "Well?" Deborah asked, her voice tentative. "It's over," Joseph said simply. Nick confessed. Deborah let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging with relief. "I never thought I'd see the day," she said, her voice breaking. "After all these years, he's finally going to pay." Zoe sat beside her mother, taking her hand. "It's going to be okay now," she said softly. "We can finally start to heal." Deborah nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I just wish it hadn't taken so long. I wish I could have been there for you." Zoe squeezed her hand. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." Over the next few days, the news of Nick's arrest spread quickly. Headlines painted a picture of betrayal and greed, detailing his manipulation and the years he had spent hiding Deborah. For Joseph, it was a bittersweet vindication. The public now knew the truth, but the scars Nick had left behind would never fully heal. Zoe spent more time with Deborah, learning about the life she had lost and the woman who had loved her through it all. They shared stories, laughter, and tears, slowly bridging the gap created by years of separation. One evening, as they sat together in the penthouse's cozy library, Deborah handed Zoe a worn journal. "I kept this while I was there," she said hesitantly. "It's not much, but it helped me hold on to hope." Zoe ran her fingers over the leather cover, her heart aching at the thought of her mother's isolation. "Thank you," she said softly, "for never giving up." Deborah smiled faintly. "How could I? You were always worth fighting for." Meanwhile, Joseph focused on ensuring that Nick's trial would proceed without interference. He worked closely with his legal team and the authorities, determined to see justice served, but the process dredged up painful memories, forcing him to relive the years of guilt and grief he had carried since the accident. One night, as Joseph sat alone in his office, staring at a photograph of his once happy family, Zoe knocked on the door. "Mind if I come in?" she asked. Peeking inside, Joseph gestured for her to enter, setting the photo aside. "What's on your mind?" Zoe sat across from him, her expression thoughtful. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, "for everything, for finding me, for bringing Mom back, for not giving up." Joseph's lips curved into a faint smile. "I should be thanking you," he said. "You've given me a second chance, a chance to make things right." Zoe hesitated, then leaned forward. "I know this hasn't been easy for you. It hasn't been easy for any of us, but I think we're stronger because of it." Joseph nodded, his eyes misting slightly. "You're right," he said. "And I promise from now on, I'll do everything I can to make up for the time we've lost." The day of Nick's arraignment came quickly. Zoe, Deborah, and Joseph sat together in the courtroom, their presence a united front against the man who had torn their lives apart. Nick entered the courtroom in handcuffs, his once confident demeanor replaced by a stoic mask. The prosecutor laid out the charges: kidnapping, false imprisonment, conspiracy, and Nick's defense team scrambled to mitigate the damage. But the evidence was undeniable, and Nick's confession had sealed his fate. As the judge read the charges and scheduled the trial, Zoe felt a strange sense of closure begin to take hold. For so long, Nick had been a shadow over her life, even without her knowing it. Now, that shadow was finally fading. When the proceedings ended, Joseph turned to Zoe and Deborah, his voice firm but gentle. "This is just the beginning," he said. "But we're in this together." Deborah smiled, her hand resting on Zoe's shoulder. "Together," she echoed. Zoe nodded, her heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time, she truly believed that they could leave the pain behind and build something new that evening as they returned home. The weight of the past seemed to lift ever so slightly. Deborah, though exhausted, smiled more easily, and Joseph's gaze held a quiet determination. Zoe sat with them in the living room, feeling, for the first time, what it meant to have a family. Though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. They had found their way back to each other, and together, they would face whatever came next. The weeks following Nick's arraignment felt like a slow exhale after years of holding their breath. For Joseph, Deborah, and Zoe, the weight of the past began to lift, though its scars remained. They had endured years of separation and pain. But now, for the first time, there was a sense of possibility, a chance to rebuild. Deborah's recovery became a central focus, physically frail and emotionally scarred from her years in captivity. She was hesitant to venture outside the penthouse. Zoe stayed close, helping her mother navigate the smallest of tasks. She read aloud from Deborah's journal, asking questions about her experiences, though she was careful not to push too hard. One afternoon, as they sat together on the balcony overlooking the city, Zoe broached a topic that had been weighing on her. "Mom," she began hesitantly, "what kept you going all those years? How did you hold on?" Deborah smiled faintly, the lines around her eyes softening. "You," she said simply. "Every time I thought about giving up, I pictured your face. I knew that somewhere out there, you were growing up, living your life, and I prayed that someday I'd get to see you again." Zoe's throat tightened, tears welling in her eyes. "I wish I could have remembered you," she whispered. "It feels like I lost something I didn't even know I had." Deborah reached out, placing a hand over Zoe's. "We'll make new memories," she said. "The past doesn't define us. What matters is what we do with the time we have now." Joseph, meanwhile, threw himself into repairing his relationship with Zoe. Though she had grown more comfortable around him, there was still a distance between them, a gap he was determined to close. He invited her to join him at work, not to immerse her in the world of business, but to show her the life he had built in her absence. One morning, Joseph brought Zoe to his office, a sprawling space filled with floor-to-ceiling windows and sleek, modern furniture. She walked through the space, taking in the bustling energy of the staff and the careful precision with which Joseph handled his meetings. "This is impressive," Zoe admitted as they sat in his office. "But I have to ask, how did you keep going after losing everything?" Joseph leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "At first, I didn't," he admitted. "I threw myself into work because it was the only thing I could control. But no matter how much success I had, it never filled the void. Losing you and your mother, it left me hollow." Zoe frowned, her heart aching for the man who had spent decades carrying the weight of that loss. "And now?" she asked softly. Joseph smiled faintly. "Now, I have hope again," he said. "Because of you. Because we found each other." As the days turned into weeks, the family began to settle into a new rhythm. They cooked dinners together, laughed over old photos, and shared stories from their respective lives. Zoe often found herself marveling at how easily she had slipped into this dynamic. It wasn't perfect, but it felt right. One evening, as they sat around the dining table, Joseph cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone hesitant. We've been through so much, and I know we're still healing, but I want us to take a step forward, to do something that feels normal." Deborah raised an eyebrow. "What are you suggesting?" "A trip," Joseph said with a small smile. "Just the three of us, somewhere quiet, where we can leave all of this behind for a little while." Zoe looked at him in surprise. "A trip, like a vacation." "Exactly," Joseph said. "We deserve a fresh start, and I think getting away from the city might help." Deborah hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her glass. "I don't know, Joseph. I'm not sure I'm ready." Joseph reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "It doesn't have to be far," he said gently. "Just somewhere we can breathe." Deborah glanced at Zoe, who nodded encouragingly. "All right," she said finally. "Let's do it." They decided on a small, picturesque town in upstate New York, surrounded by rolling hills and serene lakes. The change of scenery was exactly what they needed. For Deborah, it was a chance to step outside her comfort zone. For Joseph, it was a rare opportunity to slow down. For Zoe, it was a chance to explore the bonds she was building with the parents she had only recently come to know. One afternoon, as they strolled along a quiet lakeshore, Zoe felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. The past still lingered, but it no longer felt like a burden. She turned to Joseph and Deborah, watching as they walked side by side, their connection slowly mending. "You know," she said, breaking the silence, "I never thought I'd have this. A family." Deborah smiled, slipping an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "Neither did I," she admitted, "but I'm so glad we found our way back." Joseph nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not just about finding each other," he said. "It's about choosing each other. Every day, we choose to move forward together." Zoe smiled, the words resonating deeply. For the first time, she felt like she belonged, not just to a family, but to a story that was still being written. That evening, as they sat by a crackling fire in the cozy cabin they had rented, Deborah took Zoe's hand. "There's something I want you to know," she said. "No matter how much time we lost, I never stopped loving you, and I never will." Tears welled in Zoe's eyes as she leaned into her mother's embrace. "I love you too," she whispered. Joseph watched them with a mixture of pride and gratitude. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt whole. Together, they had faced unimaginable pain, but they had also found the strength to heal, and in that, they had rediscovered the true meaning of family. The return to New York marked a new chapter for the family. Their brief escape to the countryside had given them clarity, a sense of unity that had been absent for so long, but the challenges of the real world awaited, and they knew their journey was far from over. Zoe stood in the kitchen of Joseph's penthouse, pouring coffee as Deborah shuffled in, her steps slow but steady. It was a small moment, but Zoe couldn't help smiling. Each day, her mother grew stronger, her confidence returning bit by bit. "You're up early," Zoe said, handing Deborah a mug. Deborah took it with a grateful smile, the warmth spreading through her hands. "Couldn't sleep. Too much on my mind." Zoe leaned against the counter. "You're thinking about the trial?" Deborah nodded, her expression pensive. "It's hard not to. Facing him again. It's going to be painful." Zoe reached out, placing a hand on her mother's arm. "You're not alone in this. We'll be right there with you." Deborah gave a small nod, her eyes glistening. "I know. That's what keeps me going." A week later, the trial began. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as reporters and spectators filled the gallery. The case had garnered significant attention, a tale of betrayal and resilience that captivated the public. Joseph, Deborah, and Zoe sat together, their presence a united front. Nick sat at the defense table, his usual confidence replaced by a guarded demeanor. He avoided their gaze, his once arrogant facade crumbling under the weight of the evidence against him. The prosecutor laid out the charges in meticulous detail. Kidnapping, false imprisonment, conspiracy. Witnesses were called, including Deborah, whose testimony was both harrowing and powerful. She recounted her years in captivity, the lies Nick had fed her, and the strength she had drawn from the hope of reuniting with her family. When Deborah finished, the courtroom fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Zoe reached for her mother's hand, squeezing it tightly. "You were incredible," she whispered. Deborah gave a faint smile, though her hands trembled. "I just want this to be over." As the trial progressed, the defense tried to undermine the evidence. But Nick's confession and the mountain of documents linking him to the crime left little room for doubt. The truth was undeniable, and the jury's verdict reflected it. Guilty on all counts. Nick's sentencing was scheduled for the following month, but for Joseph, Deborah, and Zoe, the verdict was enough. Justice had been served, and the chapter that had haunted them for decades was finally closing. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed them, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. Joseph raised a hand to quiet the crowd. "Today is not just about justice," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "It's about healing. My family has endured unimaginable pain, but we found our way back to each other. That's what matters most." Zoe stood beside him, her heart swelling with pride. She had spent so much of her life feeling adrift, disconnected from her past. But now, for the first time, she felt rooted, part of something bigger than herself. The days that followed were filled with a mix of relief and uncertainty. The trial had ended, but the family's journey was far from over. Deborah began therapy to help process her trauma, while Joseph threw himself into philanthropy, using his resources to support organizations dedicated to helping victims of abuse and kidnapping. Zoe, inspired by her parents' resilience, decided to pursue her own path. She enrolled in courses to study social work, determined to make a difference in the lives of others. "If I can help even one person feel less alone," she told Deborah one evening, "it'll all be worth it." Deborah beamed with pride. "You already make a difference, Zoe, just by being you." One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Joseph raised a glass. "I know the road hasn't been easy," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm so grateful to be here, with both of you. You've given me a second chance, and I promise I won't take it for granted." Deborah smiled, her eyes shimmering with tears. "We've all been given a second chance," she said, "and I think we're making the most of it." Zoe clinked her glass against theirs, her heart full. "To family," she said simply. "To family," Joseph and Deborah echoed, their voices warm with gratitude as the weeks turned into months. The family found a new rhythm. They celebrated small victories, Deborah venturing out on her own, Zoe acing her first exam, Joseph seeing the fruits of his charitable work. Each moment was a reminder of how far they had come and how much they had overcome together. One afternoon, as they walked through Central Park, Deborah paused, her gaze fixed on a group of children playing nearby. She turned to Joseph and Zoe, her expression thoughtful. "I used to dream about this," she said softly. "The three of us, together, living our lives. I never thought it would actually happen." Joseph placed an arm around her shoulders, his voice gentle. "We're here now, Deborah. That's what matters." Zoe smiled, slipping her hand into her mother's. "We've got plenty of time to make more memories." Deborah squeezed her hand, her eyes shining with hope. "I'd like that." The past would always be a part of their story, a shadow that lingered in the background. But as the family walked through the park, their laughter blending with the sounds of the city, it was clear they were no longer defined by it. They had faced the darkness together, and now they were stepping into the light. Spring brought a renewed energy to the city. The gray of winter gave way to vibrant greens and blossoms that lined the streets. For Joseph, Deborah, and Zoe, it symbolized more than just a change in seasons. It was the beginning of a life unburdened by the weight of the past. Zoe adjusted her bag over her shoulder as she stood outside her first social work class. The small campus building buzzed with activity, students chatting and flipping through textbooks. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was the first step toward her future, one she was determined to build on her own terms. Inside, she found a seat near the window and pulled out her notebook. Her nerves began to settle as the professor started the lecture, speaking passionately about the importance of advocacy and understanding in helping vulnerable communities. Zoe felt a spark ignite within her. This was where she was meant to be. Meanwhile, Deborah was making strides of her own. With Joseph's encouragement and the help of her therapist, she began venturing further outside the safety of the penthouse. At first, it was small steps. A walk to the park, a quick trip to a nearby cafe, but each outing brought a little more confidence, a little more light to her eyes. One day, as she sat on a park bench, she noticed a young mother struggling with a stroller. Deborah instinctively got up to help, holding the stroller steady as the mother adjusted the straps. "Thank you," the woman said with a warm smile. "I don't know what I'd do without kind people like you." Deborah returned the smile, a sense of purpose blooming within her. She hadn't realized how much she missed connecting with others, offering kindness in the smallest of moments. Joseph, too, was embracing change. His philanthropic foundation, now fully operational, was growing quickly. He found himself invigorated by the work, meeting with community leaders, survivors, and advocates to discuss ways to create meaningful change. One afternoon, as he stood in the middle of a bustling community center he had helped fund, Joseph felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't about business deals or profits. It was about giving back, about creating something that truly mattered. He stepped into a small meeting room where a group of volunteers were gathered, including Zoe. She had insisted on joining the foundation's mentorship program, eager to start making an impact. Seeing her there, surrounded by others who shared her passion, Joseph felt an overwhelming pride. "You've got a natural gift for this," he said as they walked out together after the meeting. Zoe shrugged, a modest smile tugging at her lips. "I just want to help, I think. After everything we've been through, it feels right to do something meaningful." Joseph nodded, his heart swelling. "You're already making a difference, Zoe." As the weeks went by, their bond deepened. Family dinners became a cherished ritual, a time to reflect on their progress and celebrate their victories, no matter how small. Deborah began sharing more stories from her past, painting a vivid picture of the life they had once shared, though Zoe couldn't remember those moments. She listened intently, piecing together the fragments of a life that now felt more complete. One evening, Deborah brought out an old sketchbook she had kept hidden for years. "Emily, Zoe, you used to love to draw," she said, placing the book on the table. "These were some of your earliest masterpieces." Zoe flipped through the pages, her eyes widening at the colorful scribbles and playful depictions of animals and family scenes. One page, in particular, caught her attention. A drawing of a woman, a man, and a little girl holding hands under a bright sun. Above them, in wobbly letters, was written, "Mom, Dad, and me." "I don't remember doing this," Zoe said, her voice thick with emotion. "That was your favorite thing to draw," Deborah said, her eyes glistening. "No matter what we gave you, new crayons, markers, even watercolors, you always drew us." Zoe traced her fingers over the page, a bittersweet smile on her face. "Maybe some part of me always knew I'd find my way back." As summer approached, Joseph suggested a family trip to Europe. "We never took the chance to go when you were little," he explained, "and I think it's time we make some new memories together." Deborah was hesitant at first, but Zoe was enthusiastic. "We've been rebuilding our lives," she said. "This could be a way to celebrate how far we've come." They planned an itinerary filled with visits to Paris, Rome, and a small village in the French countryside that Deborah had always dreamed of seeing. The trip was everything they hoped it would be: beautiful, peaceful, and filled with moments that brought them closer than ever. One evening, as they sat on a terrace overlooking the rolling hills of Provence, Zoe turned to her parents with a thoughtful expression. "I used to feel like I didn't belong anywhere," she said, "like I was just floating through life. But now, I finally feel grounded, like I've found my place." Deborah reached for her hand, her smile radiant. "You've always had a place, Zoe. We just had to find our way back to it." Joseph raised his glass, his voice filled with emotion. "To new beginnings?" he said. "To new beginnings," Zoe and Deborah echoed, their glasses clinking softly against his. As they returned to New York, the family carried the warmth of their trip with them. The future felt brighter, filled with endless possibilities. Together, they had faced unimaginable pain, but they had emerged stronger, united by a love that refused to be extinguished. Zoe stood on the balcony of the penthouse one evening, the city lights stretching out before her. Joseph joined her, the two of them standing in comfortable silence. "You've come a long way," Joseph said, his voice proud. "So have you," Zoe replied with a smile. "We all have," Joseph nodded, his heart full. "And we're just getting started." As the city buzzed with life around them, Zoe felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. The road ahead would have its challenges, but she was ready to face them. With her family by her side, the warm glow of autumn returned to New York, painting the city in shades of gold and amber. For Joseph, Deborah, and Zoe, it was a season of reflection, a time to embrace the life they had rebuilt and look toward the future. Zoe's schedule was busier than ever. Between her social work classes, volunteering at the foundation, and spending time with her family, her days were full. Yet, she had never felt more fulfilled. Each step she took toward her goals was a testament to the strength she had found through her journey. One crisp morning, she walked into Joseph's office at the foundation, a bright smile on her face. "I just got the results of my first big project," she announced. Setting a folder on his desk, Joseph looked up from his paperwork. His curiosity piqued. "What's this?" "It's the report from the mentorship program," Zoe said, opening the folder. "We've officially matched over 100 kids with mentors in the past 3 months, and the feedback has been incredible." Joseph flipped through the pages, his expression softening as he read. "This is amazing, Zoe," he said, pride evident in his voice. "You're making a real difference." She smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "I couldn't have done it without your support," she admitted. "You gave me the chance to turn my pain into something meaningful." Joseph stood, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did this," he said firmly. "Your passion, your heart. It's what drives this work. I'm just lucky to be a part of it." Meanwhile, Deborah found herself reconnecting with old passions. One afternoon, while walking through Central Park with Zoe, she paused near a street performer sketching portraits. The artist's hands moved deftly across the page, capturing the essence of his subject with each stroke. "You used to draw all the time," Zoe said, noticing her mother's lingering gaze. Deborah nodded, a wistful smile on her lips. "I did. It was my escape, my way of seeing the world differently, but I haven't picked up a pencil in years." "Maybe it's time to change that," Zoe suggested. The idea took root, and soon, Deborah was spending hours at the dining room table, sketching everything from landscapes to memories she had long buried. Her art became a way to heal, each line and shadow helping her reclaim a part of herself. One evening, she showed Joseph and Zoe a sketch she had been working on, a portrait of the 3 of them standing together, smiling. "It's not perfect," she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "It's beautiful," Joseph said, his voice thick with emotion. Zoe nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "It's us," she said simply. "It's perfect." As the months passed, the family began to focus on the future. Deborah proposed an idea that surprised them both: hosting an art exhibit to raise funds for the foundation. "I want to use my work to help others," she explained. "If I can turn my pain into something positive, maybe it'll inspire someone else to do the same." The exhibit was held in a small gallery downtown, its walls adorned with Deborah's sketches and paintings. The event drew a crowd, many of whom were deeply moved by the story behind the art. Joseph stood beside Deborah as she spoke to attendees, his pride in her evident. Zoe, watching from the corner of the room, felt a swell of gratitude. Her parents had been through so much, but here they were, thriving, giving back to the world in ways she never could have imagined. She realized then that their journey wasn't just about survival, it was about legacy. One quiet evening, the family gathered in the living room, the fire casting a soft glow across the space. Zoe held a journal in her lap, the pages filled with notes about her dreams for the foundation and her work. Deborah sipped tea, her sketchpad resting beside her, while Joseph thumbed through a book about philanthropy. "I've been thinking," Zoe began, breaking the comfortable silence, "about what all of this means. Everything we've been through. It's like we've been given a second chance, and I don't want to waste it." Deborah smiled, her gaze warm. "None of us do," she said. "That's why we're here, to make the most of the time we have." Joseph nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's more than that," he said. "It's about creating something that lasts, something that goes beyond us." Zoe looked between them, her heart full. "A legacy," she said softly. Joseph smiled, his eyes glistening. "Exactly. A legacy of love, resilience, and hope." The years ahead would bring new challenges and opportunities, but the family faced them with a renewed sense of purpose. Together, they built a foundation that touched countless lives, creating a ripple effect of kindness and compassion. Deborah's art continued to inspire, her work becoming a symbol of strength and perseverance. And Zoe, with her unwavering dedication, became a beacon of hope for those who felt lost. On a sunny afternoon years later, the family stood together at the opening of a new community center funded by their foundation. Joseph cut the ribbon as Deborah and Zoe looked on, their smiles reflecting the journey they had shared. As the crowd cheered, Zoe turned to her parents, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We've come a long way," she said. Deborah placed a hand over hers. "And we'll keep going," she said. "Together," Joseph nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "This is just the beginning." As they stood side by side, the weight of the past fell away, leaving only the strength of their bond and the hope of the future. They were no longer defined by what they had lost, but by what they had found in each other. A family, whole and unbreakable,